Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the political crisis facing South Africa and the future of its leadership. Joining us is Dr. Kenneth Mwenda. He's an adjunct professor of law at American University here in Washington, D.C. From our newsroom, we're joined by Simon Barber. He's a journalist and writer on South African politics and culture. Also with us is Jennifer Cook. She's the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Jennifer, President Jacob Zuma, in response to some of the criticism leveled at him and the ANC, described South Africa as, quote, a success story. Is it a success story?
Well, it's certainly a success story in where it's come from. And, you know, many South Africans have been lifted up by the liberation, by the second independence, by the liberation, by a social grants program that has really raised the living standards for many. But I think there are so many very deep structural issues that the country has to grapple with. Unemployment, the education system, kind of a labor system that's quite rigid. You know, where is their future growth going to come from? Investment in infrastructure, which we're seeing from all the power outages, is you know, they're seeing rolling blackouts right now in South Africa. So it's a success story given where it came from, but it is facing some really fundamental challenges in terms of both growth and in terms of employment and poverty and education.
Right. Simon, political theatrics aside, some of the issues that Jennifer just mentioned, you know, unemployment, the fact that economic growth is so low, investment is down, etc. Why don't those issues get the kind of traction that it should be getting among ordinary South Africans when they go to vote?
Well, I think they are increasingly getting that kind of traction. As I mentioned, I think the ANC came very close to losing the elections in Gauteng province in the industrial heartland last year. I think there is a growing level of frustration with the rolling power cuts. What I'm worried about, as the ANC's economic policies fail to bring about the kind of growth and job creation that are evidently desperately needed, is that the temptation of the government will be to increasingly play the race card and to blame current woes on what was admittedly a terrifying and terrible past, rather than facing up to what needs to be faced up to now. And another problem we have is that because the president is constantly beset by these allegations of corruption, by the whole Nkandla scandal that we mentioned previously, he is not being able to come to grips with the issues that really need to come to grips with. He's not being able to take the various factions within the ANC from left to right and say, okay, here is our policy moving forward. Here we're going to have a predictable, firm policy that's going to produce results. We aren't getting that kind of leadership because of his own personal problems.
Right. Dr. Mwenda, do you agree that the political noise is drowning out everything else? Serious political discussion, political debate on where South Africa should be going?
Absolutely, there's no doubt about that. For example, one of the major issues that the region is facing now is issues of intra-regional trade within the SADC region. And South Africa has done commendably well together with other countries in the region in terms of reducing tariff barriers, but the non-tariff barriers, issues of, for example, quota allocation of, type of agricultural products that can get into South Africa. A lot of countries in the region have been complaining. South Africa is able to export, but it has a lot of non-tariff barriers which restrict trade coming in from other countries. So those are important policy issues that South Africa should be addressing right now as a giant in the region. And of course, like Jennifer pointed out, there are a lot of economic issues. What you're seeing in South Africa is actually voter fatigue. People are tired of a party that came into power. At the time when they came into power, it was genuine, it was all about liberation. But you can't sing the same old story. The world has changed, you're now faced with economic issues. How do you articulate those type of issues?
Is it changing? Because we often hear the perception that, South Africans still vote with their hearts, not their heads.
No doubt, there's an element of populist leaders in the region. It's not only South Africa. A number of countries in the region, for example, when Michael Sata in Zambia came to power, he was clearly a populist leader. You see that a bit also with Zimbabwe, Mugabe. There's a lot of populism more than sort of looking at issues of substance. So it's not unusual, and you see that in other parts of the world as well, populist leaders coming to power. If you sort of look at Thabo Mbeki and, Zuma.
Right.
One would have thought, Thabo Mbeki would have been the ideal situation, but populism takes precedence.
Jennifer, if we look at the report card for the ANC since 1994, we have unemployment in South Africa. It's remained stubbornly high. It's calculated to be around 25% right now, and that's a conservative figure. Infant mortality went up after 1994. Lifespan went down. There is now a black middle class, as we know, but it's relatively small, and the education system in South Africa is in complete shambles right now. So in that respect, I mean, as you say, there's been some success in South Africa. It was seen as the fairy tale nation, the rainbow nation as it came to be known. But in other respects, in the real, the issues that affect South Africans on the ground, has the government failed South Africa?
I think it's missed some big opportunities. The education system is one, and that should have been a top priority right from '94 onwards, I believe. And that was kind of a moment missed. And so there's a whole generational lag that's going to happen there. Investment in infrastructure, particularly in power in these big parastatals. That's not only the Zuma government, it's also the Mbeki government. If you don't have power, you can't drive manufacturing, you can't drive the kind of employment in agriculture, in mining, in manufacturing that's going to employ South Africa. There's a structural problem of unemployment, and that there just are not enough jobs. Any government coming out of apartheid would have had a very difficult road to climb because the structural history is so profound. But I think there have been opportunities lost. And again, kind of the inner squabbling and the alliance making within the ANC and this kind of scandal and the populist rhetoric has prevented kind of the really solid thinkers, and there are many within the ANC, from implementing a vision that gets South Africa over this hump. There's a national development plan that actually acknowledges some of the big failures of the ANC and the government and what needs to happen. But there isn't the same kind of momentum and strong leadership to push to implement the national
Well, it was even way
plan.
back in the 80s where the mining houses, of all people, were telling South Africa that they have to focus on the education system.
Yeah.
Simon, the country's wealth is still largely in the hands of the white minority. Is there any evidence to show that that is changing?
The country's economy, you say? Yes, it is changing, but obviously not fast enough. And the government clearly has a very strong policy of trying to seek the growth of what they call a new class of black industrialists. I would want, just to end perhaps on a more optimistic note, what we do forget is that while the government may have many woes in South Africa, we have an extremely vibrant and entrepreneurial private sector. Major companies investing throughout Africa, drawing enormous amount of investment from institutions in the US and elsewhere. Our stock market, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, is one of the most successful in the world. So there is that talent and that energy and that in the private sector, which I am very confident over time will help us through the problems we're facing now.
Dr. Mwenda, what about the political opposition in South Africa, the DA, which is the opposition party? Now we have the EFF. They've failed to make significant inroads into the ANC hold on power, haven't they?
It's not unusual. Where you have a fragmented opposition, it's expected. In many countries where we've had dominant political party over the years, as long as the opposition remains fragmented, it's pretty difficult for them to carry the day. So it's expected. I mean, DA is a union of two major political parties, the former NP and Democratic Party, to form Democratic Alliance. Then you have the economic freedom fighters under Julius Malema, plus a plethora of other opposition, smaller parties. If they could only galvanize all their energies into a unified front, they would give ANC a running for their money.
If I may follow up on that.
Sure, go ahead. One moment, Simon, I'll get to you in a moment. Jennifer, go ahead.
I think there's actually a genuine opposition forming on ideological grounds as well. I think the DA has made inroads with a middle class that's bearing an increasing tax burden for the grant and the social grant issue. As Simon said, The DA has made big inroads into the big cities in Cape Town, possibly in Gauteng, in Port Elizabeth, so some of the big city centers. The EFF, it's small, and it represents kind of a very leftist, populist program. I find them ineffectual. They don't really have any policy ideas or substantive. But there's an opening there, I think, for kind of a worker-focused, unemployed, a party to grow up that really speaks to the issues of the poor, the unemployed, and the worker.
Right.
And that's a good thing for South African democracy, that the ANC is getting challenged now, and it has to watch its back, and there may be further splits from within the party. That's a good democratic trend.
Simon, you get the last word.
Well, I would just agree with what Jennifer's just said. I mean, South African politics is evolving, and I think it's evolving in the right direction. You're having, it has been a big coalition of Labour and activists of one kind or another, and that is coming apart. You're seeing the more left parts of the Labour movements splitting off, threatening to form their own party. You have the EFF. I think we're going to be heading away from one big party state to perhaps 2 or 3 parties, competitive, each with a real platform rather than a sort of series of compromises trying to keep the one party together. So I think we're headed in a healthy direction, but it will be a few years before we get there.
Simon Barber, Dr. Kenneth Mwenda, Jennifer Cook, thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for. But the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at cctv-america. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.